don't think that there is the greatest driver of all time. Because if we think back in history, there's been Caracciola and Nuvolari, then there's been Fangio, maybe Jim Clark, maybe even a Jackie Stewart, but there's been a Niki Lauda for sure, an Alain Prost and an Ayrton Senna. In their time, they have all been the greatest of their period, of their era. But I don't believe there is one man who is the greatest of all time. But what makes a great driver? What makes a legend? Well, he has to have a talent that is God-given. It's not his own. It's a natural skill that he is gifted with. How those people manage that skill, how they manifest it, how they control it, makes the difference whether they will be the great drivers of their time.
Jackie's right, of course. Motorsport is such that it's even risky to compare the merits of drivers competing against one another. It's even more apt when those drivers haven't raced against one another and have driven under entirely different conditions. Consequently, it's quite impossible to say whether Georges Boileau was one of the greats, but he was, without doubt, the first of the early racers to earn hero status. He was the bravest of all these intrepid competitors who raced in blinding conditions on dusty circuits, driving unsophisticated, dangerously unwieldy and unstable, but already powerful machines. Boileau was leader of the Peugeot team and showed remarkable spirit and incredible bravery as he proudly and single-mindedly fought the armada of conquering Mercedes. This Franco-German battle reached its climax at the French Grand Prix at Lyon on July the 4th, 1914, where Mercedes' tortoise and hare tactic cost Boileau victory in the greatest race of his life. Within a month, however, war had broken out. The conflict would claim the life of Boileau, who was killed in the air over Verdun. When racing restarted early in the 1920s, the French were still at the forefront, with Delage and Bugatti. But the Germans were temporarily uncompetitive and were replaced by the Italians in their Fiats and Alfa Romeos. Felice Nazzaro was the most representative of their clan. Unlike Boileau, Nazzaro was less of a fighter than a stylist, more aware that one had to look after one's equipment to get the best from it. His career wasn't simply brilliant, but also enduring, lasting more than 2 decades. Nazzaro was Fiat's champion, but when they stopped racing at the start of the 20s, it was Alfa Romeo who took control with a formidable duo of drivers. Antonio Ascari, first of all, whose style was so flamboyant that it was frequently described as spectacular and even aerobatic by some contemporary commentators. However, he was killed racing in the wet ACF Grand Prix of 1925 at Montlhéry, at a corner which has borne his name ever since. The other half of the duo was Giuseppe Campari, a bull of a man who had the shape, desire, and maybe even the voice to become an opera singer. He adored eating snails, but fortunately his diet had no influence on his speed. His greatest win was in the ACF Grand Prix of 1924, when he beat Albert Divo and Delage driver Robert Benoit. But just like his teammate, Campari died racing. He had announced that the 1933 Monza Grand Prix would be his last, but he was killed on the very first lap when he lost control on an oil patch, which also claimed the lives of Borrachini and Krikowski. The 30s saw the return of Germany to the motor racing arena, and with their cars came a whole gaggle of drivers, of which the best was Rudi Caracciola, who had no equal in mastering the massive power of the Silver Arrows on the sinuous curves of the daunting Nürburgring. His style of driving was so elegant that it was almost boring to watch, so perfect and apparently easy was it. It made him almost incomparable in the wet and earned him the name Regenmeister. Thanks to the superiority of their equipment, the Third Reich's drivers almost gave the impression that they had been recruited as promoters of Nazi propaganda. But Caracciola had attracted admiration early in his career when he had demonstrated his generosity, easing up rather than overtaking when his Alfa Romeo teammate began to run out of petrol when heading for victory in the 1932 Monaco Grand Prix. That teammate was an Italian, almost emaciated in stature, but huge in talent and status. His name was Tazio Nuvolari. He was a demon, said his rivals. This Mantovan drove with such obvious bravery and impudence that they maintained that he had to have a pact with the devil himself. He was the winner of 49 Grand Prix, but on the track he behaved as though he would never be beaten.
Era molto tecnico, lui aveva tante conoscenze tecniche e tutti i suoi grandi successi e la sua grande ascesa e la conservazione attraverso vari periodi, perché c'è stata una trasformazione grandissima da fine anni 20 all'anteguerra e anche all'immediato dopoguerra, e lui applicava sempre delle innovazioni alla sua tecnica di guida. La grande invenzione che se l'è trascinata fino ai tempi dell'Auto Union era la capacità di fare il drift, la scivolata su tutte le quattro ruote, in modo leggero, però già importante perché a quei tempi non si faceva.
The rear-engined 500 horsepower Auto Union was a real beast, but the frail-looking Nuvolari was up to the task of taming it, and he could dominate it like no other. But it was in an Alfa Romeo that Nuvolari won the greatest race of his life. In fact, it was in the 1935 German Grand Prix where he gave away 30 horsepower to the Silver Arrows. And in spite of the efficiency of the Mercedes organisation, which saw them gain more than a minute over the Italians in refuelling alone, the little Mantovan won an incredible victory, cocking a snoot at the Nazi dignitaries on their home ground. This champion, whose panache had no equal, perhaps only found a successor worthy of the name 3 decades later, in the shape of another small man with a similar attitude, fired by the same determination and spirit, the Canadian Gilles Villeneuve, who drove for Ferrari from 1978 to 1982. It was a meteoric but unforgettable career.
Di Gilles non si possa dire niente di più di quello che ha fatto vedere a tutti. Era molto generoso, un uomo di grande talento naturale e di grande coraggio, molto semplice, sempre all'attacco, anche quando doveva girare per strada per andare a prendere il gelato, andava forte, faceva i testacoda, si divertiva. Principalmente si divertiva a fare il pilota.
Villeneuve's temperament was well known.
Io penso che per gli episodi che lui ha saputo far vedere agli altri, Gilles sia già un pilota di leggenda. Io voglio ricordare l'episodio, lo chiamavano il pilota volante, perché ha fatto un mare di incidenti all'inizio quando imparava. L'episodio di Zandvoort quando è rientrato al box su 3 ruote. Non era un pilota che si era costruito, era un pilota così, naturale, era veloce, con qualsiasi tipo di macchina in qualsiasi situazione.
The most famous race in Villeneuve's sparkling career was his incredible wheel-to-wheel, and we mean sometimes wheel-against-wheel, battle with René Arnoux in the closing laps of the 1979 French Grand Prix at Dijon. This was a fight to the flag, both drivers desperate to beat the other. For second place, remember, and doing all that they could while staying just within the boundaries of sport and safety. It was a duel etched in the memories of all those who saw it, one of Formula One's greatest battles. But let's go back, chronologically speaking. When racing restarted in the late 40s, it was the older drivers whose careers had been interrupted by the war who featured. Nuvolari was in decline. The new stars were Giuseppe Farina, Jean-Pierre Vimy, Raymond Sommer, Luigi Villoresi, Alberto Ascari. In 1948, the Alphas dominated, and Vimy won 2 out of the 4 major races that year. The future looked great for this Frenchman, but his career was cruelly cut short by his death when driving a Gordini at Buenos Aires at the end of the year. The driver who would become the most honored in the history of the sport came from Argentina. Juan Manuel Fangio was certainly the most successful of the drivers in the 50s, and his record of 5 World Championship titles still stands today, more than 40 years after its inception in 1950. That first World Championship was won by the experienced driver Farina, the first driver to adopt a straight-arm driving technique. But when the Italian lost form, it was the Argentine who developed into a winner, and he took his revenge in having been beaten by Farina in 1950 by winning his first title the following year. Fangio certainly dominated his era, but he had a rival in the shape of the English driver Stirling Moss, the most talented of the new generation.
Yo vi a Moss, primera vez que vine a Europa, él era un jovencito, su padre le autorizaba las carreras, lo vi correr en Monza y me llamó mucho la atención cómo se arrimaba a las curvas y frenaba a último momento.
Moss, in fact, was the inventor of the technique of late braking in a corner right up to the apex, a technique which would later be universally adopted by all drivers. He was a graduate of the British 500cc class of racing, brilliant and persevering at the same time. After an apprenticeship in outclassed and outdated British Grand Prix cars, he seemed destined to become number 1. But he came up against Fangio, his major rival and therefore also the man with whom he would most be compared. Consequently, he would be destined to be remembered most as the uncrowned champion. Was it simply bad luck? Partially, but perhaps also because he was very independent and perhaps too nationalistic, which saw him conduct his career less well than his cars, leading to inopportune choices of team which prevented him from driving the best cars. It was the greatest shame. He had so much talent.
I was always felt as a fighter. It's my car, you know, whatever happened, if I'm still running, I'm going to try and win, even if it's not impossible. You've always got this fastest lap to go to or something. And I think having that attitude, having the attitude of wanting to be a fighter, I think is a very important thing. There are things that I don't know if Fangio had them or not. He was so good, one doesn't really know whether he was a fighter or whether he wasn't.
One of Moss's greatest races was the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix, where he beat the more powerful Ferraris in his little underpowered Lotus, whose agility around the Monegasque streets he exploited to the full. Moss frequently demonstrated his brilliance and came so close to the ultimate reward of that elusive title. 3 times he finished second to Fangio and lost the title by 1 point to Hawthorn in 1958. Fangio's retirement gave Moss his best chance, but a serious accident at Goodwood meant that the title would never be his, even though he attempted a comeback.
When I went to try myself out, my lap times round the circuit were reasonable, but I could see that what had before been normal and natural to me was not. I mean, I go into a corner and suddenly think, my God, I must brake now. I must get over here. I had to work out what I had to do, whereas before it had all been natural. And I felt it was unrealistic to continue.
It was more the way they conducted their careers than the way they drove that marked the difference between Moss and Fangio. Apart from being extraordinarily talented, the Argentine was also remarkably astute. He changed teams at just the right moment, unerringly joining a team just when it was coming good. He was a protégé of Argentina's dictator Perón, who sent him to Europe in the late 40s. Fangio won his first title with Alfa Romeo in 1951, before 2 lean years without a competitive car. It was a lesson well learnt. This meagre period ended with his joining Mercedes as team leader, the German team returning to Grand Prix racing with extremely advanced machines which would outclass their rivals. Similarly, Fangio would outclass his teammates, winning his second world title easily, ahead of Ferrari drivers Gonzalez and Hawthorn. Physically, Fangio made an unlikely racing driver. He wasn't very tall, slightly plump, he spoke in a light, high voice and seemed almost reserved. But that was countered by his nose and steel blue eyes, which gave him the hungry look of an eagle. He drove with minute precision, and his mechanical background meant that he could bring home the most weary of machines. He was over 40 in 1955, but still managed to repress his new teammate, Stirling Moss, 18 years his junior.
I remember going to Monte Carlo, and Fangio did a one whatever the lap was, and I went out just after that. I took a 10th off, and I will do it. Came in, took my gloves off. He did another 10th off mine. Then I went out, took a 10th off his, and so on. So it went on until in the end, Neubauer said, "Look, cut it out." The point is that whatever is possible, like Bannister did a 4-minute mile, he would have done a 3:59.9, and whatever you'd done, he could always do that fraction more. Fangio is without doubt the greatest driver who's ever lived. I think there are other drivers who approach him on speed, but there's never been a driver that's approached him as a complete entity of a man. I'm talking now Formula One, where he was the ultimate.
In 2 seasons with Mercedes, he won 8 out of 12 Grand Prix, plus 2 World Championships to add to his first. But the German team was pulling out of racing. He moved to Ferrari for 1956, a team that he distrusted, but which held him in high regard. The atmosphere got worse and worse during the year, but Fangio still managed to win the title, just ahead of Moss and his Maserati. Fangio was well placed to appreciate the qualities of the 250F and moved to the Works team for 1957, while Moss went to Vanwall. The Argentine made the best choice, winning his 5th world title. It was during this season that he scored the greatest victory of his career. A tardy pit stop in the German Grand Prix saw him nearly 50 seconds behind the scrapping Ferrari pair Hawthorne and Collins. But on this day, Fangio was in masterly form, the Maserati flying around the sinuous Nürburgring. He not only caught the Lancia Ferraris, but overtook them and won by 3 seconds. Only a truly exceptional champion could succeed in such a gargantuan task. But this would be his 24th and final win. Once the fuss had died down, and with his 5th world title won, this 47-year-old, still clearly a force to be reckoned with, went for another championship in 1958, only to retire in mid-season.
Cuando fui a correr a Rennes, mi coche primero no se mantenía bien, que era una de las particularidades más exponentes de Maserati. Entonces yo pregunto a Guarino, ¿qué pasa con el coche que no se tiene? Dijo, cambiamos los amortiguadores. Pero ¿y por qué? Si los otros andaban bien. Me dijo, no, porque estos pagan. Entonces yo me di cuenta que la cosa ya era distinto. Dije, ellos pagan, pero soy yo el que corro en el auto. Y largamos la carrera y a las 15 vueltas se rompió el pedal del embriague. Me quedé sin el embriague. Así que me paré en el box, le di el pedal, lo tenía ahí en el piso, y ellos me pidieron por favor que siguiera. Me empujaron el auto y seguí. Y llegué cuarto. Yo soy un hombre que creo en el destino. Quizás me ayudó mucho la suerte y el destino. Y ya tenía más de 46 años. Ya tenía que esforzar más que los jóvenes de 20, 25, 22. ¿No? Y que esa fue una decisión que tomé en ese momento y nunca me arrepentí de eso. Usted sabe que siempre está quien lo alaba, quien le dice, sos el mejor, a vos sos imbatible, y el peligro es creerse que es el mejor. Claro, así que esto, dije, es el momento oportuno para dejar las carreras.
He retired as the reigning world champion, and his remarkable record made him the racing driver of the era, the example of the perfect driver. 3 decades later, his fame and success are still legendary. In the early 60s came another legend, a man whose speed and perfection had his rivals and spectators alike gasping in admiration, Jim Clark. Clark was a driver of class. The way he came alive in a racing car, particularly at the start of a race, was symbolic of his career, meteoric.
Jim Clark was first and foremost a Scottish farmer. He really wasn't made to be a racing driver. He was introverted, he was shy, he was really a man who felt more at home on his farm, on his land, with his sheep and with his farm workers and fellow Scots.
But Clark was one of those lucky sportsmen who possessed unique natural talent. All he needed was the catalyst to draw it out of him. And that catalyst was Colin Chapman, the man behind Lotus. Together, they performed miracles. From an apprenticeship in Formula Junior, Clark went on to be the first great Formula One champion of what was then the dawning age of rear-engined cars. He outclassed his rivals with serene confidence. Throughout his career, he would remain a Lotus driver and dominated the 1963 and then 1965 World Championships.
Jim Clark was the best racing driver I ever raced against. He was so smooth, so precise. He did it so naturally. He seemed to take so little out of his car. He always seemed to be going slowly, and yet he was going very fast. If there's a driver that I modelled myself on, it would be Jim Clark.
During his relatively short but brilliant Formula One career, Jim Clark established several remarkable records which stood for many years before being either equalled or broken. He won 25 Grand Prix, one more than Fangio. Started from pole 33 times, a record only beaten by Senna a quarter of a century later. And 7 of Clark's poles were in one season, when there were only 10 races in total. Remember, it was to Lotus and Jim Clark that Ford would entrust their new Cosworth DFV V8, and Clark won with it first time out at Zandvoort in 1967. The shape of contemporary Grand Prix cars during Clark's heyday somehow seemed to match his own speed and style, particularly on the ultra-fast circuits where precision was all important. He was a master of Spa, even though he hated the place, where his 1964 race average was nearly 133 mph in a 1.5-litre car. 4 times he won in Belgium from 1962 to 1965. He was a 4-time winner in England too. Clark finished the 1967 season on a high with 2 consecutive victories in America and Mexico. The Clark, Chapman, Duckworth trio seemed invincible, a driver with style and 2 geniuses providing his equipment. Who could rival it? They seemed set for a lengthy reign, even if the driver was indicating that he would like to retire and return to his farm in Scotland. The 1967 title had gone to Denny Hulme, but there seemed every likelihood that a 3rd world title would come Clark's way. Sadly, this was not to be. On a miserable April afternoon at the perilous Hockenheim in 1968, Clark was driving in an unrewarding Formula 2 race. For no traceable reason, although probably technical, his Lotus left the road at high speed and disappeared into the unprotected forest. There, an artist perished. Jim Clark had been the last of the great gentleman drivers who raced for the love of the sport and the pleasure of driving, with no great eye for personal gain. Jackie Stewart, who would succeed him, knew him well.
Only in his last year did he really develop as a personality in himself, and only late in his career did he have any real confidence, or did he recognise his real superiority as a driver. So he was really a contradiction to the modern Grand Prix driver. He was entering a period of his life where he would have had to change enormously, and I'm not sure he would have been prepared to do that.
Thus ended the romantic era of racing. In 1968, the age of sponsorship would begin. One Scot, Jackie Stewart, succeeded another, Jim Clark. The character and temperament of these two drivers were very different. It was as much because of his professionalism as his talent on the track that helped Jackie Stewart become the dominant driver of his era.
Today the sport gets to a much wider public because companies who are using motor racing to attract attention to their products have gone out, have advertised, have projected motor racing to a new group of people. Motor racing used to be a very small interest group. Today, the whole world knows about motor racing.
Stewart's career may have taken off in 1968 thanks to his association with the arms manufacturer turned racing car constructor Matra, but his success was also strongly allied to Team Tyrrell, in whose colours he raced almost throughout his career. But this was a partnership that was somewhat different to the Clark-Chapman duo. There may have been less genius influence, perhaps less bravery and panache, but there may equally have been more discipline, order, and down-to-earth efficiency. Stewart was always very conscious of the risks he ran in racing and relied only on his team patron to guarantee the safety and reliability of his cars, just as the pair would plan the best tactical and strategic options for a race. The effectiveness of this partnership became apparent when they won the 1969 championship. From that moment on, Stewart was considered as one of the great drivers in the sport thanks to his professional and intelligent approach and his precise style. He was certainly professional, but he also loved car racing.
Well, I think a racing car is something very special, almost in the breed of an animal. Not only is it like an animal, but it's also like a woman. It's very sensitive, it's very nervous, it's very highly strung. Sometimes it responds very nicely, sometimes it responds very viciously. Sometimes, to get the best out of it, you have to coax it and almost caress it to do the things you want it to do. And even after you've done all these things, and the car is doing exactly as you want it to do, it will immediately and with no warning change its mind and do something very suddenly, very abruptly.
No amount of brilliance could transform some cars, however, and the average march that Stewart drove in 1970 wasn't sufficient to retain the title. But Stewart and Tyrrell learnt from the experience. Tyrrell decided to build his own cars, and it was a wise decision. He and Stewart won titles in 1971 and 1973. Stewart was at his peak. However, he wasn't entirely satisfied, for he was campaigning for an improvement in the safety arrangements at circuits, and that earned him numerous critics. Little by little, the idea of retirement would become more and more attractive, as did the idea of a protégé. That's how he became the mentor of his teammate François Sévère, an association marked by friendship in a sport which more often generates rivalry.
The next big long one, if you gear it for third gear, where else will you use third gear?
Just there, because if you go around this double right, you have to put third between this and the S.
With 3 world titles and 27 victories, Stewart, encouraged by his wife Helen, decided to retire at the end of the 1973 season. But it only took place in the most tragic of circumstances.
I suppose I had been involved in many motor racing accidents, had seen many people die, and have certainly lost many friends. But Francois' accident really was the last straw. It was the last thing that could happen to me really in motor racing.
Give the car, it's not a nice impression, you know. See, all vibration. It's not
Saga was killed in practice for the final race of the year, the American Grand Prix. Devastated, Stewart quit the sport without even taking part in what would have been the 100th and final race of his career. In so doing, he proved himself to be anything but the grasping professional and the snivelling apostle of safety which his enemies had unjustly accused him of being. The man who took up his mantle was Niki Lauda. This Austrian was even further removed from the romantic ideal of the past than Stewart. Distant, sometimes sarcastic, he had a Germanic obsession with efficiency. After a laboured initiation to the sport, Lauda overcame his lack of natural talent by dedicating himself to demonstrating that the right approach and hard work would always pay dividends. He joined Ferrari in 1974, when they were at an all-time low, but he brought to this most Latin of teams the kind of discipline that they lacked. Having galvanized the various departments within the Scuderia, he then helped them to their most successful period in racing. They came close to winning the title in 1974, but succeeded the following year, ending a 7-year run for cars powered by Ford's V8 Cosworth. Lauda was on course for more of the same in 1976, when his Ferrari got away from him in the German Grand Prix. Badly burnt, he courageously returned to the cockpit 6 weeks later at Monza, but he was scarcely fit. In his absence, James Hunt had gained on Lauda in the championship and was now almost level.
When you have an accident like mine, I was running on reserve already, I would say the last 4 races, because I was nearly dead and it was not easy that year. So I came on reserve into a race where the conditions needed a strong man with all the reserves for this difficult decision to say, today it rains, I don't care, I'm still strong and I'm go for it. And then the condition got more and more difficult, so therefore I said, I'm too weak to take this extra with rain. So I said, no way. I was unlucky that after 15-20 minutes of terrible racing, the rain stopped. So, okay, I lost the championship, but I think the decision at that time was right and I would do it again.
In a downpour at Fuji, the last round of the series, Lauda, still not fully recovered from his voyage to hell and back, pulled out, unhappy with the conditions, and he lost the title. But he had his revenge the next year and won the title that was justifiably his. But he'd been badly hurt by Ferrari, who had doubted whether he could be as competitive as before and had hastily signed Carlos Reutemann, whom Lauda didn't want as a teammate. No sooner had he won the title than he quit the Italian team.
If you come to the point where you come to a team and you see always the same faces and the same spaghettis and whatever, it's a pure, normal human reaction that sometime in life you feel for a change. Nothing against the Ferrari people. The main reason was simply that I was ready for a change.
The cunning Bernie Ecclestone wasn't about to let the reigning world champion pass him by, and Lauda found himself driving for Brabham. But the cars were outclassed by the ground effect Lotuses, and Lauda was up against the talented Brazilian newcomer Nelson Piquet in his own team. Lauda admitted that he had lost vital motivation, and right in the middle of the first day of practice for the 1979 Canadian Grand Prix, Lauda walked out with scarcely a word of explanation or goodbye. It was an exit totally in character with the casual temperament of a man to whom sentiment meant little. But his substitute was already primed.
Bon, il y a un truc qu'il faut essayer, enfin que je voudrais essayer si on a le temps, c'est jouer sur les amortisseurs et sur la barre avant.
Je vais te demander, tu n'as pas du tout de pompage là?
Non, pas du tout.
Parce que René il pompe comme une vache.
Pas du tout.
Formula One was changing. The turbo era was in its youth, led by the Renault Elf team, of which Alain Prost was the #1 driver. Prost's motor racing apprenticeship had been rapid and successful, racing school to Formula One in 5 years. His first Grand Prix victory came at the French at Dijon in 1981. It was the first of an extraordinary series of wins, which is unrivaled in the history of Grand Prix. Prost was one of a new generation of drivers who had cut their teeth in karting and racing schools. He had natural class and style allied to a sixth sense in racing and a talent at setting up a car. It made for an exceptional driver. His calm, fluid driving style, at the same time hard and forceful, made him one of the most brilliant in the sport. He hated to lose, which meant that he won races which sometimes seemed lost, such as the 1982 South African Grand Prix, which also marked the return of Lauda to racing after 4 years of retirement. It was an event that was as expected as controversial.
Est-ce que vous croyez à la réussite de Niki Lauda? Ça dépend ce qu'on entend par réussite. Si réussite veut dire gagner tous les Grands Prix et être champion du monde, non, pas, mais à ce qui marche bien, à ce qu'il soit compétitif, oui.
Il y a une chose qui est sûre, c'est que je lui souhaite de réussir parce que son retour est très courageux. Je l'ai approuvé dès le début, donc je peux que lui souhaiter une grande réussite. Et de toute façon, me battre contre un pilote de sa trempe, ce ne sera qu'un honneur pour moi si je le bats, mais je lui souhaite bonne chance en tout cas.
These were ironic words for Prost. 2 years later, he would find himself teammate to Niki at McLaren. The confrontation between the old and new number ones seemed particularly pertinent and lively. Up against the young lion, who had virtually only driven turbo cars, the old hand had to readjust his driving style. It wasn't easy. But he used all his cold cunning and intelligence. He may not have been able to match Prost on pure speed alone, but he still had the odd card up his sleeve. He exploited his own racing experience and one or two of the mistakes due to the inexperience of his young rival to just head home his teammate by a nose after a thrilling race for the title. Just half a point separated the two after an unforgettable 1984 Portuguese Grand Prix. Lauda had won his third title after an historic comeback.
I'm most proud, I think, of '84, where after 10 years competitive Formula One racing, I still won the race or the championship by half a point over Prost, because it was hard. There was the young generation trying to blow me off, and it did work. So I can say for 10 years with up and downs, I kept going upwards. I think this was the most difficult thing.
Prost would learn quickly. He learnt all he could from being so close to a professional as methodical and experienced as Lauda. The Austrian had shown him how to assume the position of number one, to get the team behind him, to leave nothing to chance, to spare his car and himself, to help his engineers get the best out of the car.
Because of his natural talent, he doesn't have to force it to achieve the performance, and therefore he always has a little bit left, and this gives him the capability of operating within himself, and therefore he is never stretched.
Consequently, in 1985, the roles were reversed. The newly nicknamed Professor used his recently acquired science to good advantage and turned the tables on his teammate. Prost would become the first French Formula One world champion in the history of the sport at the end of the European Grand Prix at Brands Hatch on October the 6th, 1985. The new number one was a perfectionist and a tireless worker. He would turn out to be more Latin than his predecessor, particularly in his relationship with a racing car.
Ma voiture, j'ai l'impression de toujours faire corps avec. Je sais pas comment dire, c'est pas comme une personne, comme un être humain, mais c'est quelque chose de très dangereux. Mais j'essaye de la dominer, mais c'est souvent elle qui me domine. Et on a une relation un petit peu bizarre ensemble, mais pour moi, c'est un bijou.
But Prost had basically become a talented and, above all, tactical driver, which earned him his second World Championship title in 1986, in spite of a less competitive car than the Williams Honda. For while Mansell and Piquet lost points to one another in their pointless race against one another for the title, the cunning and determined Prost used what he had to its greatest advantage. A thrilling final round in Australia saw him come from behind and take the title from his two rivals. He was unquestionably the champion of the turbo era, the 80s, during which he averaged 4 wins per year. That was twice as many as either Piquet or Senna, the next most successful drivers of the decade. He took 2 consecutive titles in 1985 and 1986, then lost out to the mounting power of the Williams Hondas and Ferraris. But he was still able to salvage the odd victory, such as his record-breaking 28th victory in Portugal, surpassing Jackie Stewart's record.
C'était le type de course où on doute jamais, où on sait que normalement tout doit aller très bien jusqu'au dernier tour. Même quand j'étais deuxième derrière Berger et qu'il restait peu de tours, je pensais que soit j'allais le rattraper doublé, soit il allait faire une faute. J'étais vraiment très confiant.
Berger, pushed hard by Prost, had to give best with just a few laps to go.
J'étais sur 2 titres de champion du monde, 85-86. 87 était une saison moyenne avec simplement 2 victoires avant celle-ci et beaucoup de problèmes de moteur, donc on était un peu frustrés, toute l'équipe. Et cette course, c'était, je crois, comme un championnat, peut-être même plus.
Piquet took the championship again in 1987, but in 1988, Honda took their powerful engines away from Williams to McLaren. That alone wasn't enough to guarantee Prost the title again. He may have been able to count on the best car and engine combination in the field, but he had to cope with a rival, and a dangerous one because he had the same equipment, his own teammate.
Il y a 2 sortes de concurrents. Il y a l'adversaire qui est dans une autre équipe et il y a le coéquipier qui est aussi lui un concurrent. C'est souvent celui-là le plus redoutable, car c'est c'est les talons.
That teammate was Ayrton Senna, the rising star, and the partnership with Prost at McLaren turned from being a duo to a duel. Unlike Lauda, who knew that his career was in its twilight, Prost refused to accept that he wasn't as quick as the newcomer, and what followed was a merciless battle which ended by turning sour. After Senna took the title in 1988, Prost took his revenge in 1989, following a tangle between the 2 teammates at Suzuka, a disputed situation which saw Prost leave the team. But he found a well-paid home at Ferrari, where he was welcomed as the Messiah. They'd been chasing the world title in vain for 10 years. The Frenchman came close to taking the title to Maranello in 1990, but his hopes were dashed by another collision with Senna at Suzuka. The Brazilian later admitted that he had purposefully hit the Frenchman in revenge for the previous year's accident. Sacked by Ferrari in 1991, Prost temporarily quit the sport and left Senna to claim the title of undisputed #1. Senna was the latest in the Brazilian line of world champions, preceded by Emerson Fittipaldi and Nelson Piquet. He came to everyone's notice at the 1984 Monaco Grand Prix, when he fought through the field in pouring rain, driving the relatively uncompetitive Toleman, and all but overtook Prost when the race was stopped. Snapped up by Lotus, the obviously talented Senna rapidly established himself as the new force in motorsport. What made this fanatical perfectionist even more special was his constant quest for the ultimate performance, remarkable vision and relentless determination.
Unless I have a feeling that I'm giving my very best, I don't feel happy. And in order I can give my very best, I have to concentrate, I have to work hard, and I have to push all the time myself and the people that are working around me to improve and to be better.
First of all, he became the all-time #1 in the pursuit of pole positions. Nobody knew quite how to get the best out of the super sticky but short-lived qualifying tyres like Senna, nor how to clear the track of traffic to give him a clean run. Added to these talents was a mysterious personality, and the combination was sometimes worrying, sometimes frightening. Senna's first Grand Prix victory came in Portugal in 1985, his second season, and as a result of a remarkable drive in soaking conditions as at Monaco a year earlier. Such was his car control and supremacy above all others that some nicknamed him Magic that day. The strength of his powers of analysis, his nerve and his confidence have all contributed to his remarkable results.
un talent naturel énorme. Il a l'intelligence, il a la jeunesse, il a la sensibilité pour les réglages, que ce soit moteur, que ce soit châssis. Je pense qu'il a vraiment tout ce qu'il faut pour être champion du monde. Il sera champion du monde.
In 1988, Senna joined McLaren alongside Prost, who hitherto had been unrivalled since Lauda's departure. This was his home ground. The Brazilian would have to intrude to establish himself in the new team. But apart from his remarkable qualities, Senna came with one more specific asset: the loyalty that his perfectionism had instilled in the Honda mechanics since his days at Lotus. The Japanese engineers were great fans. No one else spent so much time with them, helping them understand and in turn helping them to conquer the world of Formula One. That year remains in the annals of Formula One as an incredible one. Statistically, the McLaren pair came close to a Grand Slam. They won 15 Grand Prix out of 16. 10 times they finished first and second, 6 more than the previous record. Such dominance suggests a very tedious season, but it was far from that. In fact, it was one of the most lively ever. Prost and Senna almost took turns at winning in their fascinating battle, as though they were following a script. The Frenchman had the best start to the year and equalled his own record of 7 victories. But the Brazilian would equal that and then score one more, winning the championship in the face of his more senior colleague in his first season with the team. It was a remarkable feat, but according to Senna, just one step on the way to his holy grail.
There is a big difference between winning a championship or being a true champion. Every year there is a winner, but not every year there is a champion.
In truth, the new world champion had been affected by a psychological war that Prost had waged against him in order to destabilize him.
What can disturb the image of a champion is polemics and antagonism coming from people who cannot accept being defeated and trying to find excuses when they lose instead of recognizing that they have been beaten. That can make a lot of distortion.
Prost was a past master in the art of manipulating the media and had instigated a campaign to suggest that his team favoured the other driver at his expense. And Senna, with a touch of the spoilt child, was attempting to get his own back in the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix with a risky overtaking manoeuvre, only to find Prost slamming the door, and not very well. All hell broke loose. While blame could be attributed to both drivers, Senna became the scapegoat. He was disqualified and didn't simply lose the championship, but also his dignity. He was mortified, certain that he was the victim of a conspiracy and consequently set out on a futile crusade against the governing body. But these events, far from undermining his confidence, actually strengthened it. Having been accused of dangerous driving in 1990, this time he treated his critics with scorn. And he got his own back on Prost the following year by turfing him off the track at Suzuka and taking the championship. Just revenge for what he regarded as similar treatment suffered a year before, which had cost him the title.
I have had great races in my career, fortunately. But I'm still looking for my best one in the future.
Senna would go on to win a 3rd title in 1991, and he could go on to equal, if not beat, the magnificent record of 5 titles won by Fangio. But there will be plenty of young drivers trying to beat him. Who will be the legendary drivers of the future?